presentation we have for you today. It is near and dear to all of us, and we're actually really excited because we think we're going to go. I am going to now toss things over to Nathan Hegan. He is our director in the travel department. I would also like just because Nathan rarely will talk about himself too much, but just to kind of give all of you a little bit of background on Nathan. He has been in the office more probably this past year and a half than he has ever been during his time here employed at the museum. But Nathan travels all over the world developing these fabulous itineraries for us and cultivating guides and historians that you're getting ready to hear from. But anyway, take it away, Nathan, and happy travels, everyone.
Yeah, so thanks, Lisa. And this is a program, the Seine River Cruise to the beaches of Normandy, that's a really fantastic one for the museum and really especially for our department. It combines the beauty of sailing on the Seine River from Paris to Rouen on the #1 river cruise vessel, Uniworld's Joie de Vivre, one of the newest ships on there, and by far the most luxurious, the one with the best amenities. And we combine this battlefield tour with the river scenery. And by bringing in the historians, Craig Symonds and John McManus, you're really getting a great picture, both on lectures on board the ship and at the chateaus that we stay at in Normandy. A really great blend of Craig Symonds bringing in the naval aspect, this big picture, and John really drilling down into what happens with the Americans on Omaha Beach. This is our route. You would arrive in Paris October 31, transfer directly to the ship, and we sail to Rouen, as you see, with the little excursions to the riverside towns up to Dieppe, that ill-fated reconnaissance in force from August 1942. And then we bus over to one of two fantastic chateau properties, Chateau Le Chenevier, near Bayeux, and between Bayeux and Caen, the 5-star Chateau de Audrieu, both of these being 5-star chateaus. You'll get the lectures in those chateaus as well. We also have on with us as viewers this time. We'll bring them to you in a way you can interact with them in just a few months as we await France's reopening that's on its way. But our great battlefield guides that live in this area that would take you around to the beaches, show you, point out private homes of who lives there and what this place was like during the war. So it really is a great program, one that we're really proud to bring to you, and that combines the best of Normandy from its beauty, its history, and its World War II significance. I want to introduce now John McManus. And John is the Curator's Distinguished Professor of U.S. Military History at Missouri University of Science and Technology, one of the leading historians of World War II. 12 books, and most of them cover some aspect of the U.S. Army in World War II, really focusing on that combat aspect of things. And the one that he's going to drill down on today is the Big Red One, the 1st Division, with his book called The Dead and Those About to Die. So I'll turn it over to John now to give you just a little taste of the type of historical content you would experience on this program. So John?
Yeah. Thanks so much, Nathan. I appreciate it. I also want to say what an honor it is to be part of this, to be associated with my friend Craig Symonds, whose work I've known and admired for many, many years. And to perhaps be the sort of peanut butter and jelly here. You know, he can certainly give you the naval side, and I'll drill down, as Nathan said, maybe into a little bit more of the soldier's experience, especially at Omaha Beach. And I can tell you the other thing too, just from having experienced tours with the World War II Museum folks, they do everything first class. It's so much fun, so well done, so well designed. And I'm very excited about working again with Nathan and Lisa, Constance Whitaker, Sarah Kirksey, all the folks at the World War II Museum. And the other thing I really like about doing these tours is getting to know the guests. You know, the big part of this is just informally interacting, hearing your stories, sometimes family stories of your association with World War II, or perhaps a battlefield we're visiting. We learn from each other, and it is really a special experience in a lot of ways. So I couldn't really be looking forward more to November than have words to express. So what I want to do today is just to give you a just a little bit of the flavor of a bit of one of my lectures and a feel for what it will be like when we go and visit Omaha Beach. So my particular area of expertise, especially, is about the 1st Infantry Division at Omaha Beach, or the Big Red One, as was their nickname. Of course, we'll visit the whole beach, including the 29th Division side, and always excited to discuss that too. But I just wanted to give you a feel for my own personal research, and bear with me because I'm going to be telling Nathan to advance and go back and all this kind of stuff. And fair warning, I get really excited about this kind of stuff. This passionate. I get very passionate, so I will get immersed in this. And you're looking here at a map that shows you the 1st Division sector of Omaha Beach. Omaha Beach is about 4.5 to 5 miles long, and obviously it was a very, very difficult objective. So the planners earmarked, the better part of 2 U.S. divisions to assault it: the 29th in the west and the Big Red One, or 1st Division, in the east. And specifically, what you're looking at there are some of the German strong points. My German language skills are not good, but they're called Widerstandsnetz, or just short WN62. So like, or WN 60, 61, 62, 64, 65. These are strong points that are basically designed to try and pin any invader onto the beach. Omaha Beach in the Big Red One sector had no paved roads, and so the best way off was the natural ravines or valleys, that you see delineated on that map and that we will visit, and you'll get a sense of, oh, that's going to be your beach exit. So naturally, the Germans are going to try and defend those particular exit points, and they really don't have a lot of soldiers to do that. Fortunately, they've got about, by my estimate, in the Big Red One side, maybe 500 to 600 soldiers, something like that. But they have some very powerful weapons within those strong points that you see there on the map. The invasion planners had divided this section of the beach into 3 prominent sectors. You can see Fox Red in the extreme east, Fox Green in the middle, and then Easy Red a little farther to the west on the sort of the right of our map. Easy Red is the largest single portion of Omaha Beach, and that's one of the places that we will visit. So what kind of weapons do the Germans have to try and destroy the invaders? Well, they've got, obviously, as we'll see, concrete bunkers, pillboxes, machine gun positions that are called Tobrücks. It's like the circular concrete fighting position that you put a machine gun nest in, or a mortar pit, something like that. But I would argue that the most powerful weapons they've got are really not delineated on a map. They're inland artillery, 24 105mm artillery pieces, all of which are pre-sighted into that beach and have live observers with intact communications calling in the fire really quite accurately, terrifyingly accurately. They've got mines in order to there's going to be a lot of dead spots in their defenses. They don't have that many people, so they've got mines throughout a lot of the area you see there on the map that are, of course, designed to impede the Americans. And of course, famously, as you see, the map shows you a German obstacle belt, and that is really a serious issue. The Germans really did most of their fortifying of Omaha Beach in about a 3 to 4 month period before D-Day, and especially with the obstacles. And the Allied planners were so concerned about this, what they had seen building up on recon photos, that they beefed up the engineering presence to try and deal with the obstacles. So about 1 out of every 4 American soldiers who goes ashore at Omaha Beach is an engineer. And the other thing to kind of step back from and to realize that Craig will get into later is that, of course, all of this enterprise is dependent upon sea power, not just the invasion, but the campaign that'll follow in Normandy, and of course thereafter, and specifically shipping. So what you're seeing here in a way is sort of the funneling of all this combat power, the kind of micro level approach to exactly how you're going to get on the beach, how you're going to take it, how you're going to stay ashore, and what you're going to do from there, and the kind of dangers you're going to face. So if we can go forward 1 slide, Nathan. All right, so this is the vantage point, in modern day from what's called WN60. And if we could just slide 1 back, that's what I told you to go, but there we go. You see where WN60 is. and that's the extreme eastern portion of Omaha Beach. And then we go forward and look at the image. Okay, you can get a sense of that. That's a kind of panoramic view of Omaha Beach, that 4.5 to 5 mile crescent, and you can just sort of, you know, get a sense of how vulnerable you would be on that beach. How the high ground kind of broods over the beach, precisely where you're landing, and how you could be bracketed with fire from either direction. Now, you know, to be sure, you know, in 1944, you don't have that much foliage. And a lot of it's cut down to create fields of fire for the Germans. And obviously there's no parking lot, there's no beach tourists or anything like that. So it's not exactly the same, but you do get a sense of the terrain. So the Allied plan, specifically the Big Red 1 plan, was designed to land what I would call like a combined arms task force, all at the same time on this minutely determined schedule, in which engineers are going to deal with the obstacles, tanks are going to come ashore to support the infantry assault teams. You're going to have anti-aircraft gunnery units that are supposed to provide fire support. All of this kind of stuff is supposed to land at the exact same time, present the Germans with far too many targets, so that they're just going to be basically overwhelmed. And then, of course, you'll have follow-on waves come in to only add to that effect. But what actually happens, of course, is nothing of the kind. What actually happens is because of the tides, the confusion, German opposition, and the tides would have taken you eastward that morning. And it would have been also because of the pre-invasion bombardment, which lasted about 45 minutes or so. There was a lot of smoke and dust, so it was very difficult to determine where you were going and where you were going to land. And so the bottom line from all this is if you could go back one slide, and I keep going back and forth. Okay, the bottom line of all this is that you have these units landing piecemeal, like almost one at a time, and sometimes in the worst places. So like right under the snout of WN62, which is arguably the most formidable German fortification at Omaha Beach. So you've got people landing, particularly E and F companies, the 16th Infantry, right smack in the middle of the kill zone. At a time when the Germans can deal with them and not many other targets. You've got people mixed up in the obstacle belt. You've got tanks that the famous duplex drive amphibious tanks that have sunk rather than get ashore. You know, the plan is blown pretty quickly, and the Germans are able to kind of focus on one group after another and to just devastate them with firepower. And that's partially why Omaha Beach is such a crisis point early on that morning. You're also landing at low tide too. That's another point I wanted to make. So you're talking about 400 to 600 yards of beach that you're going to have to negotiate, you know, in order to get forward. So if we move forward one slide just to take a look at that again, okay, that's not low tide, but it's also not high tide, but it does give you some kind of sense of what you're going to be crossing. Now, if we go ahead one, and we'll visit this very spot. Okay, this is the heart of Easy Red Beach. Okay, so now you're looking inland, and you can see that ridge line that's sort of brooding over you. And at that tree line is more or less where the American cemetery is today. Okay, so you'll notice closer in, see those rocks, that's what's often called the shingle bank. That's the remnants of it, and you would have had that in 1944, and it gives you a sense of a kind of false sense of security if you're a soldier stumbling ashore, getting across that long low tide beach. Now this is the first place you can take cover and have a little bit of cover from machine gun fire, from some of the mortar fire, but really it's not safe. In fact, it's a terrible place to be because the artillery I mentioned, you've got shells coming in, and of course those stones there, you know, multiply the fragmentation effect of the explosions. The other thing too, that's kind of interesting from the base point of visiting, is you can walk along that beach today and look at some of those stones, and especially closer to the cliff sides under WN60, and you can find rocks that are still scarred by ordnance, and so you can have that kind of tangible link to the Omaha Beach battle. But so you know, you got guys who have been in landing craft for at least 2 hours or so. Many of them are seasick. They're adrenaline surge. They are in the great American tradition, loaded down with way too much stuff, 70 to 120 pounds. They're wearing specially impregnated uniforms that are supposed to protect them against the possibility that the Germans use poison gas. And they're uncomfortable, they're confining, they don't breathe. and they have a stench like sour milk. The soldiers nickname them skunk suits. And so a lot of people are just kind of just staggering around, at the time when you really need to move fast. They're staggering around. They make very, very good targets. And of course, there's a lot of crowding on the beach. There's a lot of people taking shelter at the shingle bank there, more or less looking ahead like you are in that image. If we could go on to the next one. Okay, now you're looking back towards WN60, and this then gives you a sense of, at lower tide, I don't know if this is extreme low tide, but at lower tide, how much beach you're looking at, and then where the shingle bank leads all the way to that cliffside you see there. Okay, that would be like Fox Red and Fox Green Beach. Okay, so you got a pretty bad situation on your hands with a lot of people pinned down, a lot of German firepower coming in. The first hour to an hour and a half is not particularly good. So today, I just wanted to give you a sense of a couple of individuals who we will, discuss when we go to Omaha Beach, and who I think arguably, contribute as much as anything to the outcome at Omaha Beach. If we could go forward one, there we go. All right, so the second guy from the right is Lieutenant John Spaulding. Lieutenant John Spaulding led a boat section, and that's about 32 soldiers, so it's like an understrength platoon. A boat section from E Company 16th Infantry. And it's one of the units I mentioned a moment ago that kind of veered off course and went straight into the kill zone underneath WN62. Spaulding's group actually landed in the right spot, and that was vital because that was a safer area. So if we could flip back just a few slides to that original map we were looking at, Nathan. Yeah, okay, so you see where you got WN62 and WN64. Spaulding lands more or less right smack in the middle. Okay, and the next group that I'll talk about under Joe Dawson lands more or less at the same spot about 20 to 30 minutes later. So if we advance forward, yeah, so you can see, okay, they'll be right almost in the middle of our image there, and then we go forward one more. It's more or less what you're looking at right there is, roughly the Spaulding landing spot. So it's not an easy landing. In the sense that there's still some mortar fire and whatnot, but the biggest issue is there's all these sandbars and flooded areas and whatnot, and so they're landing in deep water. They lose some of their equipment. Some come close to drowning, but they get ashore intact, and they're not really harassed by all that much fire. They're out of communication with E Company, which is getting decimated. And they got to figure out how they're going to get off this beach. So there's barbed wire there. There's some mines beyond, and so let's go forward 2 slides, Nathan. Spaulding, and then the next one, he's assisted by Tech Sergeant Phil Stresik. Okay, here you have a really interesting leadership dynamic. Spaulding was seeing his first day of combat, but he was no kid. D-Day was actually his birthday. I think it was either 29 or 30. I don't recall precisely which, but he'd been in the Army since 1941. He came from Owensboro, Kentucky. He had a wife and young child back home. He was a sports writer in American or in civilian life. He loved baseball. It's one thing I can really relate to with Spaulding. Spaulding was a huge baseball guy. I am too. And Spaulding, was someone who had gotten through infantry OCS and is leading in his first day of combat against a fairly well combat experienced group, especially his second in command, Tech Sergeant Phil Stresik, who embodies the sort of veteran nature of the Big Red One. The Big Red One, as you probably know, had fought in the Mediterranean, had carried off a couple invasions in North Africa and Sicily. It had a reputation as a go-to unit in combat, as one that really would get results. But off the line, they could be a handful. They love to fight. They love to carouse. They love to get in trouble. But I would say by D-Day, maybe 40 to 50% of the soldiers are new replacements who've been melded in with this culture, though. Stresik has seen a lot of combat. He's from a big Polish-American family. He'd had, with 10 kids, he'd had to leave school after 8th grade in order to help support the family, and he'd kind of found a home in the Army. If you would have taken a poll on the eve of D-Day, who's the bravest guy in the division, he would have gotten a lot of votes. So he knows what's what, but there's this interesting tension between him and his boss, who's a rookie. But whatever it is, it works because they're quite effective. Stresik helps find a way through the barbed wire, sniff out the mines, find a pathway off that beach. It was roughly the pathway that leads up to the Normandy American Cemetery. And so this group is one of the first ones off the beach. We'll never know who's really first, and I think that the issue is kind of pointless. What we can say is certainly they're one of the first, and what they do is quite important, in part because of what Streisik is doing, but how Spalding is keeping these guys together. If we go to the next slide, okay, this is Captain Joe Dawson, who is a company commander of G Company 16th Infantry. So this is a follow-on force that's coming in about 20 to 30 minutes after Spalding and Streisik are able to get off the beach at that point early on in the day and begin to sort of wreak havoc on the Germans. Interesting dynamic here too with this guy. He's a brand new company commander, but he's not new to combat. He'd been a staff officer. He'd seen a lot of action, but he'd never been the guy in charge. He's taking over for a very popular leader, his buddy, Ed Wazensky, who was the commander, ironically enough, of E Company that's getting decimated under WN62. And Dawson's not sure if his guys will follow him or if they'll really respect him. So he's determined to lead from the front. He came from a prominent family in Texas. His father was a very well-known Baptist minister, and Dawson had attended Baylor University, but was a geologist, and so he knows something about the topography of Omaha Beach and where you're likely to find mines based on the rock formations and the soil and all this kind of stuff. So he also helps go in the direction that Streisik and Spalding have led as well. And in fact, Spalding and Dawson, one of the things I found out in my research, they encounter each other on D-Day, and they basically coordinate their movements. So if we go to the next one, okay, so basically, they're landing right between WN62 and 64, and the Spalding group heads towards WN64, so westward, and they basically make life miserable for small groups of German and some ethnic Polish soldiers who had been impressed into the German army or had volunteered rather be slave laborers, something that was particularly irritating to Streisik, who was a Polish American and spoke Polish, by the way. So they are basically working over WN64 in the course of the day, thus making it considerably safer for follow-on forces to land. That is their biggest contribution, is that they're keeping those Germans at WN64 fairly busy. And the Spalding Streisik group is in combat from about 6:30 in the morning until that evening, fighting their way around that formation. Dawson and his company heads in the opposite direction towards Colville-sur-Mer, behind WN62, and they get involved in close-in fighting, like building to building in Colville-sur-Mer, another place we'll visit that has a beautiful church with a church steeple that you can kind of see from the beach too. And the profound irony and the tragic irony of this whole thing. And here's Dawson, the son of a Baptist minister, considers himself to be a devout Christian. He and a couple of his soldiers enter the church, and they find what was probably a German artillery observation team, who were probably also Christians, as they would have thought of themselves. And yet here they are in a house of God, basically killing each other face to face. Dawson and a couple of his soldiers basically kill that German observation team, and then G Company fights much of the rest of the day in Colville-sur-Mer. So what I like to say is that, like the Dawson group, the Spalding Streisik group, they're like knives in the vitals of the Germans. You need a lot of follow-on forces, but these are the first indicators that the German fortifications are going to collapse. And so, by the end of the day, they've administered enormous damage upon the Germans. Biggest tragedy for Dawson and his people is the greatest loss of life he suffers is at the hands of friendly fire. The U.S. Navy had pre-planned firing on Colville-sur-Mer unless they heard otherwise by evening, by like 6-7 p.m. And G Company didn't know that was coming in, and so Dawson lost at least 7 or 8 killed that day, and of course was very sad about that for the rest of his life, as you can imagine. Just the miscommunications and the fog of combat. Spalding and Streisik did survive D-Day. The section lost 2 killed and 8 wounded. 7 of the men in that 32-man section received the Distinguished Service Cross, including both Spalding and Streisik. So these are just a few individuals who I think play a particularly prominent role, but obviously there's many, many others. And what you're looking at here is the situation at the end of the day on D-Day. it's not really a front line so much as it's just these sort of American perimeters that are carved out there. And most of the surviving Germans are just trying to get out of there. And they're bumping into U.S. patrols, they're bumping into U.S. positions. And the battle is very fluid, but obviously the Americans have won it. What's the cost for the Big Red One? By my estimate, and I think this is a little lowball because it was only what I could actually document with an original primary source. Big Red One suffered 1,174 casualties, including 300 killed that day. But there were other attached units that suffered casualties, and so I'm sure the number is probably higher, but that is at least a basic estimate. Now, you may wonder, are any of these Big Red One soldiers who were killed on D-Day, are they buried at the Normandy American Cemetery? Yes. About 100 of them are buried there, and some are listed on the wall, the missing, but many, of course, are buried in graves there. And one of the things that I think is particularly moving and special is when we get the opportunity, after having learned about some of these individuals, who they were, what they did, to actually go and visit their graves. I find that incredibly moving. Dawson, I think, sort of wrapped all this up when he was reflecting on D-Day a couple of weeks after it. And he wrote to his family, he said, "What little satisfaction gained from it," and he meant the invasion, "has been the belief that it was all worthwhile and that this was shared by all our loved ones and those who represent our nation." And I really think he encapsulated how we as Americans were going to view D-Day, so many decades later. So again, that to me, I think is really all I should say about it. I really look forward to going there with you all and to getting a little bit deeper into this as well. I'll turn it over to Craig and Nathan. Thank you.
So, thank you, John. It was fantastic. And the vantage points that he showed from those photos are roughly some of the same vantage points that we see on tour. So to stand there and wherever the tide happens to be, to imagine what that was like on June 6, 1944. So I'm gonna bring in Craig Symonds now. We did, as John mentioned, kind of the knife into the Germans, that first cut is what John was talking about. And with Craig now, we'll get a chance to back up a little bit and look at this in a large picture of getting across the channel. So I'm gonna bring in Craig Symonds now, who is the Professor Emeritus of History and former History Department Chair at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, where he taught for 30 years. The author of 16 books on Civil War and World War II topics, and his book that's on the screen here, Operation Neptune, received the 2015 Samuel Eliot Morrison Award for Naval Literature. So Craig, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Nathan. I appreciate that very much. And let me say first how thrilled I am to be partnered with John McManus for this adventure. I'm a great admirer of his work. He said some nice things about me, and I'll reciprocate, but it's absolutely true. First of all, he is reliably authoritative, and you have just seen how compelling he is as a storyteller. So I know that we will all learn a great deal about the Battle ashore from D-Day forward, especially on the American beaches, Utah Beach, and in particular Omaha Beach. And second, I'm glad to have an opportunity here to argue the Navy's case that the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe did not begin with that storming of the beach. Indeed, that act was the culmination of a long process. Every American who's viewed those opening scenes in Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan surely has a vivid mental image of what it must have been like on Omaha Beach on the morning of June 6th. To me, it's one of the most memorable scenes in all of motion picture history. It inspires horror at the cost of the war and admiration for the men who were compelled to endure it. It's as gripping an opening scene as there is in the cinema. But like all great historic events, it is a moment with a long backstory, one that traces its origins at least back to December 7, 1941, and in fact, even before that, to May of 1940, when the British Expeditionary Force evacuated the beaches at Dunkirk, because that was when the British, and soon enough, the Americans, began to think about how and where, but particularly when, they might be able to re-enter the European continent in force. But before any of that could happen, before Tom Hanks or anyone else could storm Omaha Beach, the Allies first had to recruit the armies, train the men, build the planes, the tanks, the artillery pieces they would need to engage their foes, and above all, and I'm glad that John mentioned this in his remarks, they had to build the ships. First of all, they need ships to carry the men and their equipment across a broad ocean from the United States and Canada to the British Isles. Then they needed more ships to guard the transports from the Nazi U-boats as they made that crossing. Then still more ships that would keep those men supplied while they trained in England. And that meant not only bombs and bullets, but also, because it was an American army, Hershey bars, cigarettes, mail, magazines. And then still more ships were needed, very specialized ships that could carry them across the channel, land them on a defended beach, and keep them supplied there. And I'm not done yet, because since it was a global war, the Allies needed still more ships, thousands more, in fact, to fight a simultaneous war in the Pacific. So here's my central argument today. That voracious demand for ships, thousands of them, tens of thousands of them, was the single most important factor in planning the Allied invasion, because without the ships, any planning at all was simply fatuous. In short, the complete history of D-Day was not only that brief, horrific moment of unimaginable heroism and sacrifices on the landing beaches that John talked about just now. It was also the years of planning, building, and training. And that's at least part of the story that I want to share with you on our journey down the Seine and on the invasion beaches themselves. But to get us all started in thinking about that big strategic picture, let me start with an actual picture. Nathan, can you put up my photograph, please? I only have one to share with you. I'm not like John with a whole bunch of pictures. I've got one. This is a photograph that was taken on August 5th, 1941. That's still 4 months before the U.S. entered the war after the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7th. It was taken on board the British battleship Prince of Wales, which was still showing battle scars from its fight with the German battleship Bismarck earlier that year. The Prince of Wales is anchored in Argentia Bay on the coast of Newfoundland. FDR had slipped away from the capital to meet Churchill in secret, so secret, in fact, that he actually gave the Secret Service the slip. Imagine that happening today. Well, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I plan to use at least that many to go over this extraordinary photograph. You all know those two guys in front. There's FDR on the left, flashing his famous campaign smile. From the very beginning of the war, Roosevelt had supported Britain in its unequal contest with Nazi Germany, and he did so not just with words, but with supplies and equipment, stretching the law, and his critics said the Constitution too, almost to the breaking point, to ensure that the British could hold out against the Nazis. And he did that at great political risk. American isolationists, including spokesmen like Charles Lindbergh, most clerics, most Republicans, in fact, even FDR's own ambassador to England, Joseph P. Kennedy, father of the future president, all opposed him on this. One reason was because they believed such support clearly violated the spirit, if not indeed the letter, of American neutrality laws. And in addition, many of them were convinced, in fact, that Britain was certain to fall to Hitler anyway, in which case any supplies and equipment sent to them would end up in the hands of the Nazis. FDR bet that Britain would hold out, and he was determined to do all that he could to ensure that it did. He convinced a majority of Americans, mostly through his fireside chats, that Britain's survival was essential to American security. And he got his way on most issues, including Lend-Lease, the program that arguably at least allowed Britain to survive, barely, through those dark days in 1940 and 1941. Now, to FDR's left, your right, as you look at the photo, is, of course, Winston Spencer Churchill, looking rather puckish here, I think. The gravel-voiced survivor of 1,000 parliamentary debates and the determined foe of what he always called Nazism, almost as if the word Nazi derived from the word nausea. Churchill was grateful for the help that Roosevelt sent, but what he really wanted was American belligerency. So consequently, throughout the period of American neutrality and even during the war, Churchill was the supplicant. Roosevelt was the one being wooed. At the time of this photograph, Roosevelt still hoped that the United States could limit its role in the war to being what he famously called the arsenal of democracy. In effect, he hoped the United States could continue to provide the planes, tanks, and other equipment through Lend-Lease, while Britain and her Commonwealth partners, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, could not only hold out, but eventually win the war. That hope became much more realistic after Hitler's foolish, stupid, and eventually fatal invasion of the Soviet Union in June, just 2 months before this clandestine meeting took place on the Prince of Wales. So what FDR wanted was to have American money, Russian blood, and British grit combined to beat Hitler without Americans having to go to war. Of course, the strategic landscape changed dramatically after Pearl Harbor. The news of that attack thrilled Churchill. At last, he had the United States all in as a full partner in the war, though he had to wait 3 days after the Day of Infamy before Hitler declared war on the United States. Sorry about that. Didn't turn off my phone. Churchill claimed later that his first thought on hearing of the attack was, so we had won after all. As if the mere fact of American belligerency assured a final victory. Churchill did have one more worry, though. It was that given the character of the Japanese attack, American public opinion would force Roosevelt to concentrate on the Japanese in the Pacific rather than on Germany. Revenge is a powerful motive. Well, he needn't have worried, not about that anyway, for as it happened, in the months before Pearl Harbor, the United States settled on a new policy based on the assumption that Hitler's Germany was by far the more serious threat and that it would have to be defeated first before the US turned to the threat from Japan. It was an American admiral, Harold Stark, who was most responsible for that shift in grand strategy. He's in this photo too. That's him on the right with all the stripes on his sleeve. Stark's plan was to focus on Germany first, and that became the key element of American pre-war planning, and Churchill was absolutely relieved to hear it. On the other hand, Churchill also soon came to realize that when the Americans said, let's beat Germany first, what they meant was, let's do it right now, at once. This, after all, is a rather quintessentially American attitude. We are not, as a rule, a patient people. When we decide what we want, we usually conclude we want it immediately. So the American point of view was, in effect, let's invade now. The British response to that was something like, well, yes, that's all well and good, but after all, we have to be practical about these things. Their preference was to postpone any invasion of Europe until the Nazi Empire was on the brink of collapse, so that a landing would be a simple matter of walking in and sweeping up the wreckage. This difference in views led the British and American planners into a running dispute that lasted most of 2 full years. The principal advocate of an early Allied landing in Europe was United States Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall, who I think could reasonably be considered the principal architect of Allied victory. he's here too. That's him in between FDR and Churchill, talking to, or perhaps more accurately, listening to the American Chief of Naval Operations, Ernest J. King, who is the one directly behind FDR. King was skeptical of the Europe First strategy, not officially, of course. He was a lifelong professional, and he would not openly contradict the president or his policy, not directly, not openly, not officially. But King was also determined to ensure that the Japanese did not get a chance to consolidate their triumphs in the Pacific while the Anglo-Americans were busy defeating Germany, for that would mean that the eventual Pacific campaign was more difficult and more costly. So Marshall knew that to get his way, he had to convince not only the British, but he had to convince the US Navy as well. Note the fellow, by the way, just to Marshall's left, that is over Churchill's left shoulder, to his right as you look at this photo. He's looking somewhat suspiciously at the conversation between Marshall and King and seems to be trying to eavesdrop on it. And well, he might. That is British General Sir John Dill. Churchill brought Dill with him on both of his trips to North America, and in the end, Dill stayed behind in Washington to serve as a kind of liaison between the English-speaking allies. Like Marshall, Dill was, I think, a much underappreciated player in the development of Allied strategy because he had that rare ability to smooth over rough patches in the alliance. He was willing to talk back to his own superiors in London, even Churchill, if that was necessary, and he gracefully represented British views in Washington. It is not too much to say that he was the grease that made the alliance work. Dill lived long enough to learn of the success of the D-Day landings, but not to witness the end of the war. He died in November of 1944, just before the Battle of the Bulge. He is one of only a handful of foreigners to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. As significant as the cast of characters who are in this photo is the fact of who is not. Not pictured here are the Russians, who at this time were bearing the full brunt of the war against the armies of Nazi Germany and were positively frantic for the Anglo-Americans to open a second front in France immediately to take some of the pressure off the Red Army. Stalin suspected, and not without justification, that Churchill's opposition to an early second front was because he, that is Churchill, was willing to fight the Germans to the last Russian. There are two more characters here I want to point out who also played roles in the planning that led to the beaches in Normandy. They are there on the left, talking to one another. The fellow with his hands behind his back is Harry Hopkins. Hopkins would prove as important in holding together the English-speaking coalition as Dill, and maybe more so. Hopkins was Roosevelt's most trusted advisor, second only to Eleanor. He was, alas, a sickly wraith of a man. You get some sense of that from this photograph. He was a cancer survivor. Most of his stomach had been cut out of him, and as a result, he could not process food properly. He weighed just over 100 pounds and was easily exhausted, though none of that stopped him from working 20-hour days. Roosevelt exploited him terribly, repeatedly sending him on long trips to London or to Moscow in an effort to hold together the fragile anti-Axis coalition. The workload probably killed him, though unlike Dill, he at least lived to see the end of the war. He died in January of 1946 at the age of 55. The handsome fellow who was talking with Hopkins is Averell Harriman. FDR had sent Harriman to London to coordinate Lend-Lease aid to the British. Churchill may or may not have known that the 50-year-old and married Harriman was having a torrid affair with Churchill's 21-year-old and married daughter-in-law Pamela, who was married to Churchill's only son Randolph, then serving with the British Army in Egypt. Decades later, long after the war was over, Harriman and Pamela would marry, and decades after that, Pamela Harriman would become John Kennedy's choice as United States ambassador to France. There's only one other person I've not identified here. That is the fellow on the extreme right talking with Harold Stark. That is Dudley Pound, first Sea Lord of the Royal Navy. He too was in ill health and would be long gone before the D-Day invasion took place. So here they are. Here's the cast of characters in the long, often pointed, occasionally bitter negotiations between the Americans and the British. Not so much about whether to invade. Officially, at least, everyone agreed on that. The question of where to invade still had to be decided, and there would be a lot of conversation about that too. But most important of all was the question of when to invade. For the Americans wanted to do it as soon as possible, a point of view powerfully endorsed by the Russians, while the British wanted to wait until Germany was tottering on its last legs and then kick down the door. In the end, this, like so many aspects of the Anglo-American conversations, would be a compromise. But none of it could be done at all, early or late, or in a compromise moment, without the wherewithal, without the men, the equipment, and most of all, the sea lift capability to get them across the ocean, across the channel, and to keep them there. So on our cruise down the Seine, I want to talk about how the Allies managed to assemble the shipping, to build not only the number of ships needed to transport 1 million men 3,000 miles across an ocean infested with U-boats, but also how they built specially designed ships to conduct the invasion and to maintain the 1 million or more Allied soldiers they deposited on the beaches of Normandy. And I also hope to talk about several critical moments during the invasion when things might have gone horribly wrong and didn't, or at least not fatally wrong, in part at least because of the Allied navies. I hope I'll be able to deal with any questions you have about the strategy, the invasion, the landings, as well as the logistics of the invasion, and of course about the general role of Allied navies, and in particular the US Navy. And if there are any questions I can't answer, I'll just say, well, you know, John is the real expert on that. You should ask him.